Uh, First of all, Colin and students at the Marine Institute, thank you for inviting me for this presentation. I hope that you will find something of interest in this. The focus for today wasn't really what Colin had requested. He just kind of had an open invitation, but I figured the thing that might be most relevant is the work that I've done with expert knowledge holders on white sharks in New Zealand. So the title for the presentation is Sweet As, and I don't know if anybody here has been to New Zealand, but that's kind of it's one of the things they say. Canadians and Kiwis live in alternate realities. We are very, very similar in most regards, and in the things that we're different in, they're quirky and a little bit humorous. So fantastic knowledge holders and their fantastic stories. And Mango Taniwha is the Maori term for the great white shark, both in a cultural sense as a totem, but also with regards to the white point. They call them white pointers there. A little bit of background, marine biology. So in that sense, we have a common denominator. I grew up in Northern Ontario, but I came to the University of Guelph, and I was just fascinated with white sharks. It was actually the reason why I became a biologist in the first place. And it was through that education that I got to know more about animal behavior, fish behavior in particular. So for those of you that deal with fish, even understanding the distinction between shoaling and schooling, it's an important thing. You have to get to understand the world through the fish's eyes. I did a URA with David Noakes, animal behavior guy who passed away last year. Went on and did a master's in animal behavior, and then came back to the University of Guelph to do a Ph.D. on environmental embryology using those killifish that Colin was talking about. In terms of work, oh, and by the way, that whakapapa, WHs in Maori are pronounced as Fs. That means where I come from in their cultural sense. They trace it all the way back to the canoes that brought their people through the Pacific migration to Aotearoa, the land of islands. So I got this freshly minted PhD, became a fisheries ecologist with the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation. They deployed the largest First Nation fishery in the Great Lakes. Did that for a bunch of years, and then Nawash created with the University of Guelph a sponsored faculty position, first of its kind as far as we know, in a science department. And in the terms of reference for that, I was supposed to focus on fisheries ecology, the role of science and management, all that good stuff. But the old people said that I was also supposed to devote a significant chunk of energy to improving the engagement between a reciprocal and meaningful relationship between Indigenous and science knowledge systems. As part of my work, as a faculty member, sponsored faculty member, we did a lot of things that we tried to pair between Canada and New Zealand, including a pair of symposia. Because we have the same British Crown, we have the same British Crown's duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous cultures and Indigenous knowledge systems in matters that affect them in their territory. And I'll try and keep things on pace here. The focus here then, for as a case study, is I knew I had a sabbatical coming up back in 2015, and I knew that the New Zealand, south end of New Zealand was a hotspot for white sharks. So I figured I would combine several of the things that I loved and ask and answer questions about the role of Indigenous, local, and science knowledge systems in understanding the ecology and the human decision-making regarding these white sharks. Don't need to tell you guys that the oceans are full of a whole bunch of different kinds of sharks. Oh, Colin, give me a little feedback if you're still there. In terms of background, is this a fish crowd? Is it a kind of a broader marine ecosystem crowd? What is it?
I think it's probably more fish, but there is a lot of just broad ecosystem stuff too. So
okay,
it's not just fish.
Good. So people will know about elasmobranchs generally. Just to put things into context, oodles of sharks species, a whole bunch of different kinds. For our purposes, we're focusing in on the lamniforms, or the lamnid sharks. And within that group, it's quite a broad ecological range of life history styles. So you've got everything from the whale shark and the basking shark, which, as probably people know, are planktivores. And these are absolutely amazing animals. But when you think about it from an ecological perspective, that's really something that over evolutionary time, you have not just apex predators, but you've also got animals that In the same way that whales, the largest vertebrates in the ocean, need to feed close to the bottom of the trophic web, in the same way the whale shark and the basking shark, both seen here feeding, are they follow the same general ecological principle. If we consider the white shark, so number 10 is a basking shark, number 10 is a white shark. They actually have many of the same external morphological features to them. As a matter of fact, there's a famous story about a fellow that was diving in murky waters off the coast of California, trying out a new camera, and he felt comfortable when he saw this shark come up because it was moving nice and slow and everything, and he swam next to it, took a bunch of pictures. It was only when he took the film in that he realized he wasn't swimming next to a basking shark, he was swimming next to a very large white shark. So Carcharodon, I do this mostly for undergrad students that are kind of new to sharks here, but Carcharodon carcharias, and if you take the name apart, gives you a little insight once again into the life history. Saw teeth. So, I mean, if you've ever had a white shark tooth, I mean, these are serious implements. As a matter of fact, I just sent off a couple of articles to some colleagues about work that was done down east by Matthew Betts from the Museum of Civilization. He's a zoo archaeologist, and he was investigating, he was working with Indigenous people in the Atlantic Canada region, and he was discovering that the use of these white shark teeth in burial sites, and also, I mean, there's a whole extensive catalog of war implements and jewelry. These are obviously very prominent features of the animals. I have lost the ability to control the slides here, guys. Oh, right. And once again, it comes back to this idea that white sharks in particular, there are a few things, orcas, and humans, obviously, that are going to pose any serious threat. Another thing that often comes up in the introduction is that people want to know the relationship between the white shark and its ancestor, Megalodon. This is a grossly oversized jaw that was reconstructed, if you wanted, on the basis of these fossil teeth from organisms that lived, very large organisms. You can see the Megalodon teeth next to the white shark teeth on the left. Realistically, option B in this case is probably most similar to what Megalodon was. It was definitely a big animal. But I mean, once again, thinking about it ecologically, it takes a lot of energy to keep these things alive. And what we have now as the contemporary version of the white shark model still pretty much follows the same basic path. Contrary, what a terrible, terrible movie. I don't know if you ever saw it. Meg? Anyways, trying to keep things moving on. I've got a few minutes to catch up here. All right, distribution and abundance globally. So this is a figure that was taken from a recent scholarly publication where a bunch of white shark ecologists globally came together virtually and tried to figure out what the key uncertainties were. But I'm using this to show you basically a couple of things. Number one, global distribution. They're all over the planet. But also, if you're looking for patterns, you see that they extend, they're not in the tropics for the most part, but they have a fairly broad north-south range that takes them from temperate through tropical, near tropical, subtropical waters. And I think that tells you a lot about the animal because in part, it has to be able to cope with those temperature regimes. And as many of you know, or some of you might know, they have a form of temperature regulation that's built on muscle dynamics that allows them to live and be quite active in very cold waters. That's going to become important later on. But also you can see that both coasts of North America, and if you go over, I mean, the ancient Greeks knew about the white sharks in the Mediterranean. Same is true for the Asian coast. But if you turn your attention to the bottom right corner, you'll see that not only is there a very healthy, not healthy, but a very wide distribution for South Africa, but the same thing is true for Australia and New Zealand. Just to put things in a little bit of a homebody context, this is a nearshore depiction of where the animals are in North America. And you can see that including Newfoundland and Labrador, and that this is old data. I have no doubt about the Gulf of Mexico side of things, but I'm really quite interested to find out in some upcoming work just how far north these animals go. And my reason on the Atlantic side, and my reason for saying that is several of the people, expert knowledge holders that I interviewed in New Zealand, they were absolutely shocked to find out about an attack that took place on the Campbell Islands on a dock researcher, because it was so far south of what they thought the southern range was. So these animals are obviously distributed further than we expect, but because they're cryptic, we often don't pick up on them. This is an older CBC article that points out a couple of things. Number one, Chris Fisher and Bob Hooter, who are running the OSearch satellite tagging program, they've been doing this now for several years. And one of the key uncertainties that they're trying to unlock is, where exactly are these white sharks, these big white sharks, where are they engaging in courtship and mating? They have internal fertilization. They have to have some form of getting to know each other, but they're very cryptic about that as well. Nobody has ever seen, or there's only one instance where anybody has sort of seen white sharks mating. And in terms of protecting the species and understanding their life history and ecology, it's one of the big things that people are trying to get at. Some of the early OSearch data was indicating that if there is a courtship and mating ground, or a region of courtship and mating grounds, is very likely going to be in Canadian waters. I think the Americans have probably had so much observation in their territory that it's the type of thing that, well, put it this way, when OSearch contacted me when I was doing the New Zealand work, they were actually thinking Sable Island, because that's what their satellite tag data was indicating to them as being at least one potential mating ground. I don't know if you know much about courtship and mating and white sharks. As I said before, it's a kind of a careful dance. They're talking about a couple of tons of animal that have very sharp teeth. And in this case, the females actually have a thicker skin, because the males they can be inflicting quite a bit of damage when they're clamping down during mating. But see, once again, this is all from indirect observation. These are just the scars that are left over that we are presuming, because of the location of the wounds. They're not scars, wounds, because of the wounds, the location of the wounds and the size of them and shape. So big mysteries there. Moving on just a little bit to a little bit more reproductive biology, which I think is also going to be important. They are live bearers. Most people they don't associate sharks because of their ancient ancestral lineage. They don't consider them this way, but not only are they live bearers, and this is a beautiful animal. She's probably got about 6 pups in her. She's ready to release into the wild. But the animals, the pups, when they come out, are fully functional. I mean, they're fully developed. They have a full set of teeth. And there have been very few instances where gravid females have been inspected. But when we did find them, when Science Knowledge System has inspected, there's a couple of things that really shake out. First of all, the maternal white shark, the mother, invests a whole lot of energy into these creatures, as you might expect if they're coming out fully formed. And it starts with a massive energy investment in the yolk of the egg. In this case, the animal is getting along in development. It still has a lot of peanut butter sandwich left in that lunch bag. Not only that, but when you consider, comparatively speaking, the vascularization is very advanced in these things. You're dealing with animals that are focusing on nutrient delivery in that way, but also, most people don't know about this, the lining of the uterine wall within which these embryos are being developed or are developing. There's a uterine lining where the female is able to express, you can think of it as a milk, really, because the embryos drink it, and it's another supplemental source of energy input. And then towards the end of the intrauterine development, the female starts passing down unfertilized eggs, and the embryos switch from embryonic to juvenile life history because they start feeding in the uterus. And it's just too cool for school. In terms of white shark mating, getting back to that, on my way down to New Zealand, I stopped at Sal Jorgensen's shop in San Francisco, and we talked about current evidence and hypotheses regarding what actually happens. And the current hypothesis then in 2015 The offshore aggregation hypothesis is the idea that the animals migrate out to locations, mid-oceanic spots, and that these may actually be where they are imprinted to return to for courtship and mating. There is a coastal aggregation hypothesis that says that, well, they may do that, not that they may, the satellite tags are quite clear. The animals are going out there. Whether or not they're using those regions for courtship and mating, we don't know because nobody actually sees. The one indirect observation of white shark mating was made by a woman who was working for the Department of Conservation in New Zealand. She was a seal observer and she was doing census estimates at Nugget Point. And the arrow shows, so New Zealand, for those of you who aren't familiar, North Island, South Island, and then there's that little tiny island at the south end of the South Island. It's called Stewart Island. And Ms. Strachan was doing her seal observations back in, when it was a 96 article. It was 1991, there it is. And she saw what she thought were a couple of big white sharks that were fighting. But then she started to have questions about that because they became motionless and then they started going over belly. They started going over each other. And so she was wondering, and she wrote a little note in her notebook. And it turned out that prior to 96, when Malcolm Francis wrote this article, was the only indirect observation of what could have been white shark mating. Here's a satellite image of Nugget Point where she was. I believe that she was halfway down the point. And one thing that I wanted to bring your attention to is, think about this from a white shark's perspective. You've got the north side of Nugget Point, which is kind of straight up, but the south side has these embayments with sandy shoreline. And as I think will become clear later on in the presentation, that could be a very important factor in white shark mating. So one of the things that I did was I surveyed all the white shark ecologists, researchers that have published on white shark ecology, and I asked them if, knowing that there was nothing published about this, whether or not they had any personal observations or if they knew of people who had seen what they thought was courtship or mating. And the overwhelming response, I got a good response rate, and the overwhelming response was that haven't seen it, don't know anybody that has, haven't really seen any evidence. And if there was anything, it was going back to that idea of seeing females with scars. That was about it. Not scars, wounds. Okay, so put you a little context, provide you with a little context for the New Zealand sabbatical that I did 2015-16. I was based out of Otago University. You can see on the right-hand side there, Dunedin, which is home to Otago University, is at the base of the Otago Peninsula, and Otago Harbor comes in off the peninsula. And it's a key place because it was well known for quite some time as being not only a hotspot for white sharks. There's an aerial photo where you can see Dunedin at the bottom of it. But it was also, from colonization time forward, within what the Maori call Pakia, or the English, the European settlers, it was known to be a place where very, very large sharks hung out. And it was in the harbors as well. So perhaps it really didn't come as too much of a surprise to shark ecologists that in the mid to late 60s, there was a series of fatal attacks that shook New Zealand like you wouldn't believe. There were surfboarders, a spear fisherman out at the mole at the opening of the Otago Harbor, and then the two arrows that show the beaches. There was a surf lifesaver who was doing a swim competition, and there was a boarder who were all killed. One of them, the remains were never found. And that makes you ask questions about, well, what is going on with these attacks in such a short period of time in such a small region geographically? And of course, that leads to the possibility that there's a single shark, which for whatever reason has, to use the kind of Hollywood version of it, acquired a taste for human flesh. I think it's pretty clear to just about everybody that based on the number and size of sharks in the New Zealand waters, if they wanted humans, there would be a lot less humans and a lot more attacks. This was an exceptional event, but it provides us with some insight into the ecology of the animals. All right, so just to give you a little bit of context for why I chose New Zealand specifically, At the bottom of the south end of South Island is that Stewart Island I was telling you about. And just off of Stewart Island is the maximum density of white sharks any place in New Zealand. And as a result, about 2 years prior to my sabbatical, these shark cage diving, there are 2 shark cage diving operations that started up. And if you're not familiar with them, the operators take they call them punters, tourists out, and they set them up in wetsuits, and they put a hookah air supply on them, they put them down into the cage, and then they get their GoPro moment with these big white sharks. And that image on the left is not from New Zealand, because the water there is, it's gold, but it's also not nearly that clear. I can tell from that image that it's from Guadalupe, which also has shark cage diving operations. But the idea I was trying to get across here is that there are people that spend serious money to come from all around the world to go to these cage dive operations, and it's a bucket list thing for them. And they want to, for whatever reason, see these animals in their own environment. The problem, of course, is that anytime that you're using chum or burley to bring these big white sharks into close proximity, you are altering behaviorally their way of being. And there have been several examples where the shark cage tour dive operations are actually taking steps that would be described by some as domesticating the white sharks. I mean, that's just the stupid picture of the year on the right-hand side. Nobody should ever, I mean, even if the shark wasn't in a bad mood, even if the shark wasn't frustrated, even if the shark wasn't hungry or anything, that's just such a stupid thing to do, especially when it was burley that was used to bring the big animals in close proximity to the cage. Some of you a few years ago might have heard about, I think her name is Ocean Ramsey. She is a bit of a social media sensation. And remember I said about the animals that were moving from the west coast of North America, going into these mid-oceanic migrations? Well, one of the reasons why they're associating that with reproduction is that you will find pregnant females out around Hawaii, which is where she encountered this animal. And I mean, when you put a picture like this out on social media, and people who perhaps don't have much experience in the water or with the sharks, they see this, they think, oh, well, it's just like a big kitty. I'll just go out there and swim with this thing. And in some cases, that might actually be quite fine. And in some cases, you may be interfering with the animal, and the animal may tell you. It has given rise to a huge controversy to a certain extent in New Zealand, definitely in Australia, where the overlap between the white sharks and the surfing and swimming beaches and the fatalities, huge number of fatalities in Australia, especially on the West Coast, relative to elsewhere in that population's distribution. And there has been a concerted effort by government to put up nets, what they call smart drum lines, to cull the animals. And it has caused quite a bit of concern. And there is a huge controversy right now in Australia still. All right, so this is, I think, Colin, the sort of thing that you wanted me to get to, so I hope I didn't provide too much of the background context. The research project, the sabbatical, last sabbatical that I did, it was specifically focused on investigating the roles of Maori, the Indigenous people in New Zealand, local and science knowledge systems in the ecology and management of their white pointer population. And just to give you, without getting into too much detail, knowledge systems in this case, it's a phrase that you'll see in the scholarship in the primary literature quite a bit, but it was poorly described, poorly defined. And a colleague of mine, Gigi Varghese, and I put quite a bit of effort last year, no, still 2021, earlier this year, published in ecological monographs, a cultural framework. We did wasn't a full systematic review, but it was still a monster of its own. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in knowledge system thinking, there are a lot of good references, a lot of good things in there. One thing to note here, if you take a look at the graphic in the middle, is that knowledge systems as a key component of human social interaction, they exist at the individual level. So all of us individual humans have a knowledge system. We create knowledge, we learn, we use it, we share it. But it's more at the community and the cultural level that we were focusing. And in terms of the sabbatical, this particular investigation, I was making sure that I did my best to get representation culturally from expert knowledge holders from both all three, Maori, local expert knowledge holders, and the science knowledge system. In terms of design, I spread out through the southern end of South Island, and so I organized the interviews based on region around there. I also organized the interviews on the basis of experience, and then I sought to snowball, it's kind of an operational term in sociology, to be referred to expert knowledge holders across different types. Because you're the Marine Institute and because bathymetry is a big deal for us, this image here gives you a sense of the complexity. This is more like how white sharks would perceive the world down south. So you can see that you're dealing with regions that are relatively near shore and shallow for the most part, that are interconnected in ways that the white sharks are going to be following. I mean, if there is, not that there is migration, which goes across that region between Australia and New Zealand, the Tasman Sea, and the white sharks have no problems going over deep water. As a matter of fact, some of the satellite reports have shown very direct, straight line migration routes, which, you know, makes you ask questions about how the hell do these big animals know where they are in the world? There's even accounts of New Zealand to South Africa, which is huge. It's a huge distance. And it was almost a beeline that that animal made. And it was point to point in terms of source and destination. Here's a bit of a zoom in. Ecologically, the system around New Zealand is extremely productive, especially in the northern waters. So you can see off the South Island, see that ridge that extends due east? Well, that takes, that is a platform for major ecological production. And off on the eastern side of it is the Chatham Islands, which, no surprise, is also a hotspot for white sharks. So you can see that there are natural corridors and pathways. They're adjacent to deeper waters. And anytime you get upwellings and productivity that's associated with those types of features, it is definitely going to bring in fish. It's going to definitely bring in the marine mammals. It's going to support large populations of seals, sea lions, whales. And this is basically just it's a fantastic buffet. It's no surprise, really, when you think of it that way, that the white sharks are so abundant in New Zealand. Getting back to that first image that I showed you of different species, New Zealand also has a wide variety. But if you take a look at the icons, so I think they used the white upper image with the teeth, of course, for the great white shark. And you actually see more of them towards the south end of the South Island. And my argument is that if you consider the productivity and the temperature in combination, there may very well be good reasons for that. Oh, there's Malcolm Francis and Clinton Duffy for several years conducted satellite installations on some of the big white sharks. You can see that they tag fish in the Chatham Islands, they tag fish southern end of the South Island, and then they use the results of the satellite tracking to start, first of all, destroying the idea that there was a single local population of white sharks around New Zealand, because you can easily see that these things are going over to Great Barrier Reef, and subsequent satellite tags have shown that Tasmania, the island to the south of Australia, and New Zealand and the east coast of Australia, that's all one population. So that you may find an individual from that population anywhere on that chart. All right, getting back to the interviews. Organized by experience. One thing that I didn't really know till I started spending more time in country is just how much time Kiwis spend in and on the water there. And it's just crazy. I wouldn't have expected 10 years ago that New Zealand was a hotspot for surfing, but they are rabid about it. And anytime you've got people that are spending every possible moment of their spare time on a board looking for perfect waves, well, you're going to increase the possibility of shark-human interactions. Same thing is true. They have a very active spearfishing community, very active diving community, but you've also got people that are doing charters in and around coastal waters. You've got commercial fishermen of all sorts of different scales. They have a kind of technology called blinker dinghies. It's an old school approach to making dories, And you've got people that are running operations there. They're cleaning fish. Anytime you have fish offal being put in the water, you're going to attract the attention of these white sharks. So what I'd like to do just with the remainder, where am I at in terms of time here? 10:14. Okay. So just to give you a sense of how the interviews went down, the two cage tour dive operators were absolutely fantastic with me because of the fact that they saw individual animals over time through the season across years, meant that they started to recognize not just individuals and individual behavior, but they started to see seasonal shifts in the ecology as an apparent migration was coming through. Both Pete Scott, shown here, and Mike Haynes were extremely gracious. 10 hours of interviews each with them because they had so much knowledge, the vast majority of which isn't even hinted at in the scientific literature. So a couple of the key things that, as I said before, that came from listening closely to them was this idea that in season for them, in their spring, the smaller males would show up first, and then later, or a couple of weeks later, the larger males would start to come in, and it was only at the end of their summer that the large females would show up. And any ecologist would start to think, well, perhaps this is related to staging and establishment of social dominance hierarchy, that type of thing. And that was definitely reflected in what they were sharing. But getting back to that idea that there are these animals are complex. They're not stupid. And it took me a while when I was doing interviews because many of the Kiwis would use this phrase that they're not silly. And I said, what the hell does that mean? I mean, like they're not playing jokes on each other. And they said, no, that means they're smart. So if you're in New Zealand and somebody says that somebody else is not silly, it means that they're smart. And what they were trying to get across to me was emphasizing this idea of distinctive personalities, that some sharks are going to be shy, some sharks are going to be aggressive, some sharks are going to be curious. All sharks are curious, but some will be more. And the reason I show you this image is, this is an animal that had the name Slash for obvious reasons. It turns out that that Slash was actually from the scientists that were doing satellite tagging, because they were using a baited hook to bring this animal close to the boat, and the animal tore the hook out. And the cage tour dive operators both told me that before the animal received that wound, it was just another regular, you had to be careful around him, but curious, inquisitive. After the wound, this animal was noticeably aggressive, that it somehow had associated what had happened to it. This is what the tour operators were telling me, with human beings, and they had to be very careful around this animal. So kayakers, surfers, and divers. So these are people that are very close to being on the water, very personally exposed. I did more than 20 interviews with them. The average for these interviews, in contrast to the cage tour dive operators, about 2.5. And a couple of things that struck me about those, when people described shark white pointer human interactions, there were a couple of major things that popped out. One was following behavior. These animals are just outrageously curious. And in some cases, even them coming up, they can't resist coming up to the surface to check things out. So if there's something that was even floating in the water, some flotsam or some jetsam or whatever, like I remember Pete Scott telling me he had his cage tour dive operation set up, and the tidal current brought this old floating plastic white chair that had fallen off somebody's boat, and the current took it right by the operation. Well, the sharks that he was burleying in close to the cage, well, they all saw this new thing and they followed it off on the tidal current, and he lost them for the rest of the day. Second thing is this idea of, it was the power divers, they're abalone divers, that described it as a drive-by. That the shark very leisurely came in. You saw it. It's almost for sure was quite well aware of you quite some time before that, and it just passed you by. It just checked you out. So it obviously was kind of orienting towards people, but it was not at all interested, and it wasn't displaying anything that could be considered aggressive or hostile or predatory behavior. What else? Oh, the last thing here. See where it says at the bottom, KZ7, Polaris Jack and One Eye? It was also another thing that showed up in many of the interviews, that when animals were being reported, especially when they were being found in the same kinds of places over a period of, say, 3 or 4 weeks, that they would reside. The impression that the interviewees had was that these animals were residing in that region temporarily, at least, and that in some cases, given these names, they would recognize the same animal come back next year. Well, that gets the old ecological wheels turning as well with regards to the residency and whether it's strictly for the food that these animals are coming back, or is there something a little bit more going on? Commercial fishermen, this might be of interest to people in the Marine Institute. I did a whole bunch. This was a rich source of knowledge, and they were extremely kind with me. I think I was the first person that showed up at their doorstep that ever wanted to know what they thought. And I think in many ways they were, not only were they providing unique insights, especially from their perspective, obviously, many of them are going to be working with cleaning fish or fish carcasses or whatever, but they also are just out there at times when very few other people are. There was a very strong association, obviously, as I mentioned before, with the fishing and cleaning operations, but there was other stuff going on too. And they were very concerned, for obvious reasons, when the animals, the white sharks, were attacking their boats. I mean, this wasn't just mouthing the transom or anything, that they were coming down hard. And in some cases, teeth were left in the hull. And so when they went to dry dock, they didn't even know it. They go to dry dock and there's white shark teeth at the bottom. They said, oh, well, that's what happened back about 2 months ago when that shark was bullying us out. And a lot of them believe, a lot of the commercial fishermen, especially around Stewart Island, believe that the cage tour dive operations were having a pronounced, significant, their term, effect on the aggressiveness, or even if it was just the heightened curiousness of the white sharks with regards to humans. They had always been there. There'd always been some interactions, but they felt that the cage tour dive operations were significantly increasing the frequency and intensity. All right, so just to kind of wrap up, sweet as, I think I got 5 of some of the coolest stories that I think you might appreciate. First one is Johnny Malcolm. You remember the Tagal Peninsula and the beaches and the mole where those 3 60s fatal attacks occurred? Well, Johnny was hired by the city of Dunedin to be the first person to deploy and operate the shark nets that they put off the beaches. And he knew, and I think anybody who had a half a brain knew, they we're talking like 500 yards of big mesh net. That's not keeping anything over a span of kilometers, like tens of kilometers. That's not keeping any shark out. However, Johnny was an experienced commercial fisherman, and he shared with me a story because old timey, they call them gum boots. We call them rubber boots, or I don't know what you call them in Newfoundland, but they call them gum boots down there. And he told me a story about fishing for a species they call barracuda. It's not the same as the Caribbean ones, but it's basically a poor man's fish. If you don't have anything else that you can fish for, if nothing else is around, you can always catch barracuda for 2 pence a pound or something. Anyways, the way you fish them is you have a paddle that you put a couple of hooks that are bent up, and you do a figure 8, but it means you're sitting on the keel and you've got one boot in the boat, you've got one boot out over the water. And he said, fishermen who fished like that always knew that you had to be mindful because these sharks, several different species, but including the white shark, would often come up. They were quite curious, but that they would open their mouth around the boot, and he said never once did any shark ever bite, but it was almost like they had some type of a rubber fetish or something. The smell or the texture or the whatever it was about the gum boot that was on or in the water at the surface. And he said he kept one pair of gum boots for his entire career as a fisherman, never had a hole punctured in them. So I thought that was kind of a cool story. The next one is KZ7. Remember where I was talking about individual sharks getting names from the people that are around them? Well, Stefan Brown is a surfer of some renown in Dunedin, and he told me a story about KZ7 was quite famous. It was actually, the name comes from a New Zealand yacht. They're fantastic sailors. When they compete in the America's Cup, back in the day, this would have been back in the 70s, they had a New Zealand entry called KZ7. And Stefan had a direct, up close and personal experience with KZ7 off of the tip of the Otago Peninsula. And I'm going to be a little bit withholding here. If you're interested, all of these interviews are in the public domain on the project website. I would encourage you to go to Stefan. It's a rather lengthy interview because he talks about his background, but if you scroll down to direct interactions, you will hear what happened when Stefan met KZ7. Rastus Keane is an abalone or a power diver. These are all, and it's crazy because there are no tanks allowed. This all is free diving. And by government mandate, it's just insane. It's a commercial operation, but these guys are out there and they're diving in, down to 25 feet, harvesting with their knives. They're popping these abalones off the rock substrate. So they're busy and they're focused on what they're doing. And Rastus shared a story about a big white shark that was coming over top of him as he was at the bottom, and it stopped immediately over top of him. So everything you've heard about white sharks, or sharks in general having to swim in order to survive, just completely not true. He was he's a professional power diver. He was holding his breath, but there is a time where either you're going to drown or you're going to have to, pass this animal that has stopped above you. He did the latter. He swam right past it in order to get to the boat. He said he didn't even get to the side of the boat. He jumped straight into it, and the shark never moved until he was in the boat, and then he took off. So you can imagine quite a story he's got there. This one I think you might be interested in. It came from both one of the cage tour dive operators and his first mate, a gal named Nicola. And normally Nicola was responsible for, taking care of things in general. He was responsible for the boat and general operations. But if there was, typically they said it was kind of a guy thing. It was the bucket list and the guys show up, they pay the big money, they go in the cage, they see the shark. But they often took their lady friends, or in some cases you had, very rare cases, you had groups of gals. Anyways, towards the end of the day, the guys would become habituated, or the thrill would have worn off a bit, and the gals then, some of them, would have wanted to get in the cage, but they didn't want to go alone, so Nicola went with them. And it was absolutely amazing, the story they told me. They both did. Nicola from up close and personal. So Nicola says that in the rare occasions where it was an all-female complement in the crew, some of the bigger sharks responded very differently. That it wasn't so much the kind of circling behavior, the going by and kind of checking you out with their eyeball, going up and down, that kind of thing. But rather, there were a couple of cases where this big male would come up and he would come straight up to the cage, open his mouth, and press in. It wasn't hostile or aggressive anyway, but you can imagine Nicola was saying, I'm looking down the gullet of this 18-foot massive male white shark. And it is clear that this animal is, communicating. It's doing something that it never does otherwise. And perhaps the coolest part about this is that as non-scientists, both Peter and Nicola, they talked about this a lot, and they came up with the triple P hypothesis. This is not from the science knowledge system, it's from the local expert knowledge system. Because just naturally, when this happened, Nicola turned to, when they were back up top, she turned to the other gals and she said, "Is it your period? Are you pregnant? Did you pee?" And they clustered those three possible cause and effect mechanisms that in some way could account for what was happening with these big male sharks. Very rare, but very distinct when it did happen. And I think that is perhaps the best example of how complementary Indigenous, local knowledge and science knowledge systems can be if you have people who share with you the way that they think, what they think. So I thought you might appreciate that. Here's the last one. Dick Ledgerwood, one of the most respected commercial fishermen in the entire country, retired. I knew about him. I introduced myself to him. He knew so many of the people, including Pete Scott, and he knew about the controversy, and he didn't want to be interviewed. He said, You know, I've only seen a handful of white pointers in my entire life, but he was interested, and he invited me up for tea. So we became pretty good friends. And one day, as I was leaving from tea, he lived in Sawyer's Bay, right on the coast of the inner coastline of Otago Harbor, and I lived not too far away from him. And he pointed out to the harbor, and he said, "Steve, did I ever tell you about the time we saw white sharks mating out there?" And I looked back and I said, "Dick, nobody's ever seen that before. You got to let me interview you." So, anyways, long story short, he and his mate were taking a boat from Dunedin, from one of the main wharfs in Dunedin, down to Port Chalmers, which is further down towards the opening of Otago Harbor. And his mate said, "Hey, Dickie, what's that over there?" Because there was this kind of flashing. So he took the boat over, and they sat there for about 5 minutes, I think he said, directly observing a large male and a large female white shark copulating. And they were rolling over and over and over. So I interviewed him on the details of that. I'm working on a manuscript to publish in the primary literature, because it is the first time anybody's ever seen it. And so I wanted to contribute, give back to the science knowledge system in that way. But once again, if you were looking out in the middle of the ocean for courtship and mating, you wouldn't have seen this. And this is a highly populated area. And if it is the case that it is a site for courtship and mating of white sharks, perhaps really the conclusion we should be coming to is maybe it's happening all around us, but by nature of the behavior of the animals, we just don't see them that often. So let me wrap up with a couple of key points here. In terms of contributions from the different knowledge systems, there's a wealth of ecological hypotheses that are being developed in this case. But the three that I'm really kind of picking on here are all related to a new hypothesis that's developing about the possibility that if you have males that set up preferred locations over soft substrate, like what Dick saw, and they are selecting that in association with proximity to a really good feeding source, like the seal rookeries off the coast of Otago Peninsula, then it is quite possible that those males may actually set up territories, that they may actively defend against other white males, because that's their pad, and they're trying to entice the big females to come in, check them out, check the soft substrate out, maybe go for a bite to eat, dinner and a movie kind of thing, and then come back and maybe I can entice you to copulate with me. But if that is the case, then perhaps, and there's increasing evidence on this one, they may chase out non-human intruders into that reproductive territory, the males may. And that could have profound ramifications, both in terms of conservation, because we may be interfering with white shark mating systems, and also putting ourselves as humans at needless risk. If we knew if the males were setting up these territories and we knew to stay away from them, then we could prevent a whole bunch of needless attacks, because they're not predatory attacks. And there's, as I said before, quite a bit of increasing evidence that these sharks are moving you out of a place, and there has to be a reason for it. So final slide, 2 slides here, Colin. Getting back to this image. I had history, I had a sabbatical, I went to New Zealand. It was fantastic. If you ever get a chance, you have to go. But now I'm focusing on the Northwest Atlantic population. Basically, I'm taking the skill set, the experiences that I was lucky enough for the people, the expert knowledge holders in New Zealand, to graciously share with me. And I am, in my next sabbatical coming up, going to be focusing specifically on the Northwest Atlantic, May 22 to August 23. So I've got the summer coming up. I have the fall and winter off from teaching, and then I have the next summer. And I'm going to be traveling from Labrador down to the Keys in Florida, just that section of the population distribution. And I'll be going through doing exactly what I did in New Zealand, poking around in the ports, talking to the harbor masters, asking who the most experienced boaters or recreational fishermen or commercial fishermen are, the people who actually spend time on and around the water, and ask them some critical questions about distribution and abundance, but really start to dig in on this idea about residency, about the behavior of the animals with regards to humans and non-humans, and see if perhaps we can maybe get some input from the Indigenous and local knowledge systems regarding aspects of the Northwest Atlantic white shark population that so far don't appear anywhere in the science knowledge system at all. And Colin, what is it now? It's 10:30 here in Ontario. I'm pretty sure I ran over, but if there's anybody still here and you had any comments or questions, I'd be happy to ask or to answer or have a discussion with you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that was fascinating. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, just go ahead and raise your hand. I mean, I can understand some people are probably dropping off here, but
Yeah, got classes and stuff.
yeah, but it's also lunchtime, so. But if anybody has a question, go ahead and raise your hand. Looks like we have one from Yolanda.
Hey, Steve. Haven't seen you in a while.
Is this Yolanda Morby?
No, it's Yolanda.
No, Yolanda Viersma. Oh, this is the Nuds connection.
Yes, that's right. It's been a while.
Oh, crazy. Wow.
Yes.
Hello, Yolanda. How are you?
The beauty of WebEx meetings is I can join the MI seminars without having to trundle to up the hill to the other building.
Right on.
Yeah, it's awesome. That was great talk. Really enjoyed it. So you kind of hinted at this in places, but I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you're translating all this amazing Indigenous and local knowledge into knowledge systems that are applicable to scientists and/or resource management. So you showed a quick shot of a website. You talked about one manuscript that's in preparation. But I'm just kind of curious.
Yep.
A little more about that, please.
Yep. Okay. Absolutely cool. You start being trained as a scientist in the science knowledge system. Rule number one is you got to do your homework first with the literature and the experts. And by the time 2015 rolled around, I had virtually every primary and technical report, primary literature article and technical report was ever published on white sharks in the world. And what I did was, for those of you who have some experience with social science, there are tools like NVivo that allow you to take text-based knowledge and you can code them based on either a phenomena or, in our case, possible cause and effect explanation, a hypothesis, even though they may not use those words. And I started first by compiling this massive literature in the science knowledge system and started coding what it is that the science knowledge system actually knows from what has been published. Now, what scientists know that they don't publish is also a critical part of the knowledge system, even though it is not documented or less documented. That's one of the reasons why we send students off to conferences, talk to people, find out things that you wouldn't otherwise have known if you only had the literature. The difficulty there is that you need to treat knowledge holders from the three different knowledge systems the same way. And I got to tell you, Yolanda, there was a couple of the Kiwi shark scientists. They were highly skeptical of the entire research project because it became clear that they didn't trust what the Indigenous and local knowledge systems knew. And they said, well, how are you going to verify, their claims of knowledge or their perspective on hypotheses? And I kind of tilted my head and I said back to them, well, same kind of thing applies to science. How do we trust really what you're telling us? I mean, data is data, interpretation is interpretation. Yours might be different from mine. But I think the most important thing I wanted to kind of highlight here was just because a scientist has an opinion does not make that opinion scientific. That we have to have a very careful discussion about what constitutes the processes of the science knowledge system so that we can better and more transparently and accountably describe to our Indigenous and local partners what scientific knowledge truly is. So, sorry, I went down a rabbit hole on you there. Short answer to your question is social science has a whole bunch of extremely good tools with which to comprehend, recognize, manipulate, and analyze knowledge at this level. So once I did that with what was published in the primary literature, all of those hours and hours of interviews now go into NVivo as well, and I code them using exactly the same code points. So if they're talking about distribution or abundance, if they're talking about mating, and that's the best answer I have for you in terms of creating a level playing field where knowledge from whichever of the three types of cultural knowledge systems can be put on an equal footing. That answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks.
That's really nice to see you again.
Yeah, you as well. Say hi to any folks back in Guelph that still know me.
Yep.
All right. Do we have any more questions? I have a question.
Go, Colin.
So, when you said you talked to 20 or I think 20 plus commercial fishermen or 40?
I've been 30 plus. I forget the numbers exactly.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
As many people who I thought had expertise.
Sure. So with the fisheries that they were in, was it pretty diverse? Was it mostly trap fisheries? Were there
Oh
long?
yeah, no. They had well, okay. There were two major categories. And remember, I was interviewing mostly guys, exclusively guys in the commercial fishery, but they were in their 60s, 70s, 80s. I mean, they were the white hairs, right? And that was part of why I was going after them, was that they had a lifetime of their own experience, plus they had traditional knowledge. And in this case, traditional knowledge does not mean indigenous knowledge. It means knowledge that was handed down from previous generations. So if they heard from their father who taught them how to fish, that constitutes traditional knowledge. And when anybody that's part of this discussion, it's one of the points that Gigi and I bring up in that knowledge system framework article is that all knowledge systems have traditional knowledge. And be very careful in what words we're using, especially with our Indigenous partners, because a lot of times Indigenous knowledge holders feel like they're hemmed in, that because people are focusing on traditional knowledge, they're not actually giving enough credence to their contemporary knowledge, their lived experience from this life, as opposed to traditional. Getting back to the answer to your question, there are a variety of fisheries all the way around New Zealand. The big ones are going to be historically were crayfish. They've got a spiny lobster kind of creature that they call cray. So they've got cray operations. The number one target for the domestic market is blue cod, and they use cray pots and cod pots. So they're doing traps. Those typically, I mean, every once in a while you'd hear about a white pointer that got wrapped up in the lines on some of those operations. But it was mostly that they were out in places that they would see the white sharks when they were kind of cruising around or being curious coming around the boat. The most intense interactions, though, came from when the cod operations in particular, if they were cleaning their fish on the way back to port, or if they overnighted in a place, or actually one of the dominant themes from Stewart Island was a place called Murderer's Beach. And it was a place where a whole bunch of boats would moor and they would clean the day's catch. And no surprise, they would get some very large fish coming in and they just hoovered up the frames. It was crazy, but once again, it makes you think differently about the ecology of the species. Yes, these can be apex predators, but they can be very efficient scavengers too when they want to be. There were also longline fishermen, variety of different species there, and the white sharks often would get caught up in the lines that have like 300 hooks in them. And otherwise a tuna fishery, but that was further off the northwest coast of the North Island.
Okay, yeah, so you made it seem like there was like a across the board reverence for white shark, but I was just kind of wondering if there were certain fisheries where the fishermen were kind of more resentful or didn't
Oh,
like you said, 300 hooks, that probably hurts them a little bit.
oh yeah, for sure. And if people are interested in a special account, go look at Alan Anderson's interview. He's got an outstanding story as a longline fisherman about something, because they pulled in this massive white shark that had wrapped up in the line, brought it next to the boat, and he's on top. He's standing. He thought it was a basking shark, I think, and he's standing on top of the carcass, thinking it's a dead fish. It ain't dead. Anyways, I'll leave him to tell the rest of the story. I didn't mean to get across the idea that there's universal reverence. No, quite the contrary. Many of the commercial fishermen that I talk to come from an era where the only good shark is a dead shark. And in many ways, that actually traces back, I'm convinced, to the early sealer and whaler days, because there was a very strong negative reaction. And they would put out shark nets in Half Moon Bay on Stewart Island as soon as they saw a white shark come into the bay. Now, they were protecting their kids, people that were down at the bathing beach and whatever. But it's only more recently, within the past 15, 20 years, that, first of all, the white shark has received kind of conservation status, protection status. And secondly, there's a bigger general awareness about the potentially dire straits that these populations are in, and the fact that they need a little bit more understanding and protection. So it's quite split. There are some people that are just petrified. There are some people that hate them, and there are some people that love them.
All right, yeah, that's kind of more what I expected, but yeah, it's good to hear. That was a great talk, and we really appreciate it here. Yeah, it's fascinating. But before I wrap up, I do want to advertise next week's seminar again, and that's going to be Dr. Maria Gomez. She'll be joining us in person with a talk titled "Labor in Small-Scale Fisheries in Newfoundland and Labrador: A Closer Look at Recruitment, Training, and Retention of People." But as always, it'll be available on WebEx as well. So yes, so thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a good Wednesday. And I'm glad that you were able to make it, Stephen.
Yeah, finally, after Crawford's technical prowess.
Yeah,
Okay.
I even said before it started, I was like, oh, I hope everything's okay with him.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for being such a great audience, and maybe I'll see some of you in the coming months.
Thank you.